Sometimes you might want to compare two or more people or things with each other, and you will use adjective comparison to do that. So what exactly does that mean? To compare things means that you're looking at similarities and or dissimilarities of people or certain things. And when you're comparing one thing or one person with another, then you're using the comparative form of an adjective. So for example, I can say Sarah is smaller than Jane. So I'm comparing their size or height. I can also say Lucy is smarter than Bob. So I'm comparing their intelligence. I can also say the horror story is more interesting than the comedy book, or the blue shirt is less expensive than the yellow shirt. So why am I using smaller and smarter instead of small and smart? And why do I sometimes use more and less when using the comparative? Now, on the prior slide, I explained what comparatives are. That's when you're comparing one thing or one person to another. But what if you're comparing a thing or person to a group or more than just one other person or thing? Then you're using the superlative of the adjective. For example, Sarah is the smallest girl in her class. So I'm not using smaller anymore. I use the smallest because I'm comparing her to the whole class, to all the other girls in her class. Lucy is the smartest girl I know. So she's smarter than any other girl that I know. I'm comparing her to all the other girls I know. This horror story is the most interesting story I have ever read. So compared to all the other stories that I have ever read, that's the most interesting one. The blue shirt is the least expensive thing in this store. So to all the other things that I see in that store, that's the least expensive thing that I can see or that I can buy. So again, the question, why do I sometimes use smallest or smartest? And sometimes I use most and least. Now we get to answer the question why sometimes for comparatives we use, for example, smarter, but also more interesting or less expensive. It depends on the number of syllables that your adjective has. If it's a one-syllable adjective, for example, big, that's one syllable, then you're adding ER. Since big has only one vowel and one consonant, you have to actually double the final consonant. So I have bigger with two G's. If that's not the case, again, I'm only adding the ER suffix. For example, high, higher, old, older. For two-syllable adjectives, I'm also adding ER, but be aware, if there's a Y ending, it gets changed to IE. So, for example, clever has two syllables. I change that into cleverer, so I have my ER, but hungry ends on a Y. So you see hungrier has a IE. If it's three or more syllables in the adjective, you use more or less, depending on if you want to say that something is more or less than something. So for example, attractive, you would say more attractive or less attractive. Interesting, more interesting or less interesting. Beautiful, more beautiful or less beautiful. There are also regulations on how to form the superlative. Again, we have to look at the number of syllables that the adjective has. If it's a one-syllable adjective, we're adding est. So for example, rich forms into richest, strong into strongest, and tall into tallest. If it's two-syllable adjective, we're also adding est, but again, if it's a y ending, we change it into ie. So for example, quiet, quietest, funny, funniest. Yeah, so funny has a Y at the end, but now funniest has a IE. If it's a 3 or more syllable adjective, add most or least. So for example, beautiful turns into most beautiful or least beautiful. Important turns into most important or least important. And complicated into most or least complicated. But as so often, there are exceptions to the rule. So what I explained on the prior slides on how to form the comparative and superlative sometimes doesn't apply. So here are some exceptions that I listed. For example, the adjective good. The comparative would be better and the superlative would be best. The adjective bad, the comparative would be worse and the superlative would be worst.